From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
The governor of Puerto Rico is so thankful for the great job that we're doing.
Well, I'm really pleased to see them that they've rebuilt all the bridges, dredged all the water, restored the power supply, and provided emergency relief to 3.5 million people. That's a heck of a job. I'm truly astounded that was done within the space of 48 hours. The job will be done when Puerto Rico is restored as a living environment and when the Jones Act is lifted off its neck. You have a long way to go, President Trump.
1 week after Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico, leaving almost all the island without access to power, clean water, food, and fuel, President Trump says he'll visit next Tuesday under withering criticism. He's also refused to waive shipping restrictions to help get gasoline and other supplies to Puerto Rico, even though he waived those restrictions twice in the last month, following Hurricanes Harvey and Irma, which hit the mainland United States. We'll get response from Nelson Dennis, former New York State Assemblyman, about the law strangling Puerto Rico, and from Democracy Now!'s Juan Gonzalez. Then calls are growing for an independent investigation into the U.S.-backed Saudi-led war in Yemen that's ravaged the country's infrastructure, stripping the country of social services, triggering a massive cholera outbreak. We'll speak with Radia al-Mutawakil, the first representative of Yemeni civilian society to brief the UN Security Council on the war in Yemen. Then, Mohammed Yunus, the founding and managing director of the Grameen Bank, winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, on a world of three zeros, the new economics of zero poverty, zero unemployment, and zero net carbon emissions.
Wealth concentration, the way it's expanding, the way the wealth is being more concentrated more and more. People are aware that there is a concentration of wealth, but many people are not aware that it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger for a smaller and smaller number of people. That's worrisome because it creates a ridiculous kind of world. You cannot call it an economy anymore. It looks like from outside it's a plundering.
We'll speak with Mohammed Yunus about how he and more than a dozen other Nobel Peace laureates have signed a letter calling on the UN Security Council to intervene to protect the Rohingya and end the humanitarian crisis in Burma. We'll also speak to him about the flooding of Bangladesh and climate change. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. On Puerto Rico, almost all of the island remains without access to power, clean water, food, and fuel a week after Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico. Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens. Many residents are criticizing the U.S. government, say aid has not been arriving fast enough. This is San Juan resident Jocelyn Velasquez.
The aid is too slow. They say it is coming from the United States, but who are they giving it to? Because I haven't received any at my house. No one has knocked at my door and said, here's some rice.
Under withering criticism, President Trump held a news conference Tuesday in which he congratulated himself on his response to Puerto Rico's disaster, repeating nearly a dozen times he was doing a great, amazing, tremendous, and incredible job. Trump also says he'll visit Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands next Tuesday. The Trump administration's also denied a request from several members of Congress to waive shipping restrictions to help get gasoline and other supplies to Puerto Rico faster and cheaper. The decision came even though the Department of Homeland Security waived what is called the Jones Act twice in the last month following Hurricanes Harvey and Irma, which hit the mainland United States. Maria was the most powerful hurricane to strike Puerto Rico in nearly a century. It destroyed the island's entire electrical grid, caused severe flooding, widespread damage to homes and infrastructure. Flights in and out of Puerto Rico are still severely restricted. Hospitals struggling to provide care with limited access to electricity from generators and dwindling supplies. We'll have more on the humanitarian crisis in Puerto Rico after headlines. Senate Republicans have officially abandoned their latest effort to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act after again failing to muster enough votes to pass the legislation. legislation. The Congressional Budget Office says the Graham-Cassidy bill would have caused millions to lose their insurance. This is the latest in a series of failed Republican efforts to repeal Obamacare and replace it with plans that would slash funding for Medicaid and give the rich lavish tax cuts. In Alabama, former state Supreme Court Justice Roy Moore won Tuesday's Senate runoff race to fill Attorney General Jeff Sessions' seat. The race divided the Republican Party and the White House, with former White House senior advisor Steve Bannon backing Moore and President Trump going to Alabama to hold a rally for his opponent, Senator Luther Strange. On Tuesday, Trump deleted his earlier tweets supporting Strange. Judge Moore was twice ousted as Alabama's Chief Justice. First, in 2003, for refusing to remove a monument of the Ten Commandments in the rotunda of the Alabama Judicial Building. After being re-elected, he was again ousted in 2016 for ordering his judges to defy the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling legalizing marriage equality. Moore is also well known for his racist and Islamophobic positions. He was a proponent of Trump's racist and discredited birther theory about President Obama. He also opposed Minnesota Congressman Keith Ellison's election to Congress because Ellison is Muslim. Just last week, Moore used racist language to describe polarization in the U.S., saying, quote, "Now we have blacks and whites fighting, reds and yellows fighting." Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, Foreign Relations Committee Chair Republican Senator Bob Corker of Tennessee has announced he will not run for re-election in 2018. The Washington Post reports the acting head of the Drug Enforcement Agency is planning to resign in less than a week over President Trump and concerns about what he calls Trump's lack of respect for the law. Last month, Chuck Rosenberg criticized Trump for condoning police brutality during his speech to police officers in Brentwood, Long Island, New York. In response, Rosenberg sent an agency-wide memo reading, quote, "We have an obligation to speak out when something is wrong." The Department of Homeland Security is planning to collect social media information about all immigrants living in the United States. The collected information would include people's social media handles, information they share on social media, and their online search results. The Electronic Frontier Foundation said, quote, "We see this as part of a larger process of high-tech surveillance of immigrants," unquote. The rule is currently undergoing a public comment period and is slated to take effect October 18th. Meanwhile, in San Diego, California, construction's begun on Trump's proposed border wall. Contractors working for the Customs and Border Protection Agency are building 8 different prototypes of the wall. The prototypes are between 18 and 30 feet high and each costs $500,000 of taxpayer money to build. The entire wall's cost would be an estimated $38 billion. Officials say the Trump administration is planning to cap the number of refugees resettled in the United States over the next year at 45,000, the lowest level since 1980. Last year, under President Obama, the cap was 110,000 refugees. This comes amidst the world's worst refugee crisis since World War II. President Trump's doubled down on his attacks on NFL players protesting against racism and police brutality. Trump also tweeted Tuesday, quote, "The NFL has all sorts of rules and regulations." This is what Trump said at his news conference.
Well, I wasn't preoccupied with the NFL. I was ashamed of what was taking place because, to me, that was a very important moment. I don't think you can disrespect our country, our flag, our national anthem.
Also tweeted Tuesday, the NFL has all sorts of rules and regulations. The only way out for them is to set a rule that you can't kneel during our national anthem, unquote. Tuesday was the 5th straight day Trump has attacked the racial justice protests led by African-American athletes. On Monday, Trump appeared to celebrate his attacks against the players, telling conservative leaders at a White House dinner, quote, "It's really caught on. It's really caught on." Meanwhile, right-wing pastor Robert Jeffress, who sits on Trump's Evangelical Advisory Council, said the NFL players should be grateful they aren't shot in the head for protesting.
These players ought to be thanking God that they live in a country where they're not only free to earn millions of dollars every year, but they're also free from the worry of being shot in the head for taking a knee like they would be if they were in North Korea.
Tensions are rising between Iraq's central government and the Kurdistan regional government in northern Iraq over Monday's Kurdish independence referendum. On Tuesday, the Kurdish government said an overwhelming majority of people had voted for independence, although the full results have not yet been released. In retaliation, Iraq's prime minister has threatened to impose an air embargo on international flights unless the oil-rich Kurdish region surrenders control of its 2 international airports by Friday. In Mexico, anger is growing over the government's handling of the massive magnitude 7.1 earthquake last week, which killed at least 333 people. Residents say government aid is concentrated in wealthier neighborhoods of the capital, leaving poor districts and surrounding areas without help. Residents also say government rescue operations were called off too soon, leaving both bodies and possible survivors buried under the rubble. Meanwhile, crowds gathered across Mexico Tuesday to mark the 3rd anniversary of the disappearance of the 43 students from the Ayotzinapa Teachers College in the southern state of Guerrero. The students went missing September 26, 2014, after being attacked by local police. International experts say the Mexican military and federal police also played a role in the students' disappearance. The parents of the missing students arrived in Mexico City for the march in buses filled with supplies for victims of the earthquake. And in Saudi Arabia, women have won a major victory, the right to drive. Saudi women have been organizing against the ban on women driving for nearly 30 years, often taking their protests to the streets behind the wheel. This is one Saudi driver defying the ban.
We are in El Najah Street. I am going to take my sisters to do some of their work instead of waiting for the driver or someone to take them. They will be delayed, so we decided to do our work by ourselves. We are going to the salon now. I drive carefully and can drive very well. There is no danger to us, God willing.
Women in Saudi Arabia will now be able to obtain driver's licenses and drive legally by June 2018. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. 1 week after Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico, President Donald Trump says he'll visit the island next Tuesday under withering criticism. Maria was the most powerful hurricane to strike the U.S. territory in nearly a century, coming just after Hurricane Irma, and destroyed the island's entire electrical grid, caused severe flooding, widespread damage to homes and infrastructure. Most of the 3.5 million U.S. citizens who live in Puerto Rico remain in the dark without access to power, clean water, food, and fuel. It took President Trump 5 full days to respond to the plight of Puerto Rico. He did not tweet about it over that period. Over the weekend, he tweeted 17 times about athletes protesting police violence and refusing to visit the White House. Facing criticism, Trump held a news conference Tuesday in which he congratulated himself on his response to Puerto Rico's disaster, repeating nearly a dozen times that he was doing a great, amazing, tremendous, and incredible job. He denied he'd neglected Puerto Rico.
I wasn't preoccupied with the NFL. I was ashamed of what was taking place because, to me, that was a very important moment. I don't think you can disrespect our country, our flag, our national anthem. To me, the NFL situation is a very important situation. I've heard that before about was I preoccupied. Not at all. Not at all. I have plenty of time on my hands. All I do is work. And to be honest with you, that's an important function of working. It's called respect for our country. The governor of Puerto Rico is so thankful for the great job that we're doing. We did a great job in Texas, a great job in Florida, a great job in Louisiana. We hit little pieces of Georgia and Alabama. And frankly, we're doing, and it's the most difficult job because it's on the island. It's on an island in the middle of the ocean. It's out in the ocean. You can't just drive your trucks there from other states. And the governor said we are doing a great job. In fact, he thanked me specifically for FEMA and all of the first responders in Puerto Rico. And we're also mentioning with that the U.S. Virgin Islands. It was devastated. So we are totally focused on that.
But many Puerto Ricans are criticizing the U.S. government and saying aid has not been arriving fast enough. Non-governmental organizations are even reporting charter planes that brought donations for them to distribute never reached the groups because the government decided to centralize all distributions. This is San Juan resident Jocelyn Velasquez.
The aid is too slow. They say it is coming from the United States, but who are they giving it to? Because I haven't received any at my house. No one has knocked at my door and said, here's some rice.
Meanwhile, on Tuesday, the Trump administration denied a request from several members of Congress to waive shipping restrictions to help get gasoline and other supplies to Puerto Rico as it recovers. The decision came even though the Department of Homeland Security waived what's called the Jones Act twice in the last month following Hurricanes Harvey and Irma, which hit the mainland United States. Republican Senator John McCain called the decision unacceptable and called on the agency to reconsider. For more, we're joined by two people. Nelson Dennis, former New York State Assemblyman. He wrote about the Jones Act in the New York Times this week in a piece headlined "The Law Strangling Puerto Rico." His book is called War Against All Puerto Ricans, Revolution and Terror in America's Colony. And we're joined by Democracy Now! Video stream by Democracy Now! Co-host Juan Gonzalez, who's author of, among other books, Harvest of Empire, A History of Latinos in America, and Reclaiming Gotham, just out this month, Bill de Blasio and the Movement to End America's Tale of Two Cities. Juan usually would be sitting right here in the studio, but he's under the weather. And Juan, as so many people are now in Puerto Rico. But if you could just first respond to the catastrophe on your island and how the U.S. government, the majority of Americans do not realize Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens, how the U.S. government has responded to the climate catastrophe.
Well, so far, Amy, it's been too little, too late. As you mentioned, this whole issue of the Jones Act, which Nelson wrote a fabulous piece in the New York Times just this week, is one of the key problems still bedeviling Puerto Rico. You mentioned that the Jones Act was suspended just this year to benefit Texas and Florida during the hurricanes Harvey and Irma. But there's actually been previous suspensions of the Jones Act. During Hurricane Katrina, the Bush administration waived the Jones Act for a period of time to help the people of New Orleans, as well as during Hurricane Rita that occurred that same year in 2005, and during Superstorm Sandy. The Obama administration suspended the Jones Act for a period of time to allow other foreign vessels to come in and assist the people of the East Coast of the United States. So it's not unusual for the federal government to waive the Jones Act in times of major crisis. Yet for some unexplainable reason, the Trump administration has said that for Puerto Rico, which has always suffered from the Jones Act, it will not happen this time around.
Nelson Dennis, you wrote this piece, The Law Strangling Puerto Rico. Most people don't understand this law. Explain exactly what it is, what it does when it comes to getting things into Puerto Rico. Of course, it's to do with the whole country as well, around price and even access to that all.
Well, and that's precisely the case, Amy. Section 27 of the Merchant Marine Act of 1920 was initially promulgated to protect the United States from German U-2 boats. This was in 1920. But you fast forward nearly 100 years later, and there's no U-2 boats lurking off the coast of Puerto Rico. What it does, however, is it creates an international price rigging environment. The only way that foreign registry goods can enter Puerto Rico under the auspices of the Jones Act is one of two ways. The goods, all goods, food, water, medicine, oil for the electrical grid, which runs entirely on oil. All of it has to come in one of two ways. If it comes directly into Puerto Rico, it has to pay fees, duties, taxes, import quotas, all sorts of costs that are passed on to the Puerto Rican consumer. The other alternative, the only option, is to reroute to Jacksonville, Florida. The foreign registry vessel goes to Jacksonville, they offload the goods, reload onto a U.S. vessel, then that vessel reroutes back to Puerto Rico. It's the equivalent of digging a ditch to fill it again. The net result of this is that everything on those ships is then priced 15 to 20% higher because of all that activity, because of all those duties, and because of what they pay at Puerto Rico, or because of the rerouting from Jacksonville. That then creates a price rigging environment where U.S. corporations can just slightly underbid. The same automobile costs $6,000 more in San Juan than it does in Miami. Food costs twice as much throughout Puerto Rico as it does in the mainland United States. And yet Puerto Ricans, the per capita income in Puerto Rico is about $17,000, less than half that of Mississippi, the poorest state in the union. So we have a tremendous dysfunction going on. It's extremely profitable for the Jones Act carrier companies and for the consumer goods. There's more Walgreens and Walmarts per square mile in Puerto Rico than anywhere else on the planet. Puerto Rico is the 5th largest market in the world for U.S. goods, all under hyperinflated prices due to the Jones Act. That's why right now there has to be a tectonic shift in this relationship. We have to eliminate the Jones Act so that Puerto Ricans can afford to live.
So what about them saying this time around, I mean, when this just affects Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands, U.S. Virgin Islands, how do you respond to Trump saying he will not lift it now? I was just listening to Governor Rosselló this morning, and he said, yes, it must be. Well, he said suspended for 7 days.
Right. And it doesn't fly. As usual with Trump, you know, the devil isn't even in the details because they don't make sense. They're saying that, we don't have increased port capacity. The ports are what are the bottleneck in Puerto Rico, so therefore the Jones Act won't make any difference. Well, that doesn't make sense. You had Florida ports involved, and they suspended it a week before Hurricane Irma hit. They already suspended the Jones Act for Florida, and the Florida ports were involved. I did just a quick research last night and found out that the British Ministry of Defense can rebuild ports within 27 days. So by the time Trump gets to Puerto Rico, they could be halfway to rebuilding the port structure that he's supposedly talking about. It has nothing to do with the capacity of the ports. It has to do with the prices, and that's what clearly they're looking to avoid, because what we're going to get is public-private partnerships that are going to now own the ports and the rebuilding effort, everything to do with the Puerto Rican waterfront, and that's just about making money, not about saving Puerto Rico. So there is no reason why the Jones Act couldn't be lifted, and it's just plain double talk to say it won't work.
An email, a viewer wrote in and said Mitch McConnell's wife, Mitch McConnell, of course, the Senate Majority Leader, and Elaine Chao, of course, the Secretary of Transportation. Her family probably benefits from the odious Jones Act that keeps aid out of Puerto Rico and keeps Puerto Rican residents poor. Her family owns a shipping company.
Yeah, and so it's a virtual monopoly. You have carrier companies, Seastar, Trailways, Crowley. There's just a small group of usual suspects that benefit enormously from this status quo, in addition to the consumer goods companies. As I said, cars, the same car will cost $6,000 more in San Juan than in Miami. So there's a very tight knot of vested interests that are coming under the auspices of Citizens United. They're going to be lobbying intensively right now to do whatever they can to keep the Jones Act on the neck of Puerto Rico. But hopefully the human values and the humanitarian crisis that is basically exploding right now will basically offset those lobbying efforts.
Juan, have you heard from your sister in Puerto Rico at this point?
No, I have not still. She's in the town of Calle. I've been trying to reach out to other people and even journalists in Puerto Rico who I know, but there's been no phone communication. She hasn't been able to text. She and her husband have not been able to text message or to obviously get to any kind of working internet connection to be able to get messages out. We're hopeful that she's fine. But I want to bring up another issue about this. There's been reports that the entire 911 system in Puerto Rico has not been operating. And I think that this is important to understand, not just for Puerto Rico, but for the rest of the United States. After the Twin Towers attacks in 2001, the federal government, because of the communication problems that the firefighters and the police had during the attacks on the World Trade Center, the federal government spent billions of dollars to create a new emergency response system for police forces and for public safety personnel throughout the United States. It's called FirstNet. And it vowed that within a few years, all of the police departments and emergency responders across the country would have it. We are now more than 15 years later, and the FirstNet system is still not operational in times of natural disaster. In fact, it was only in March of this year, 2017, that Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross finally awarded a contract for $47 billion to AT&T to basically operate this system, because for the early years, there was all kinds of conflicts of interest between the officials who were named to the FirstNet board. And so it took a long time to get this contract awarded. It was just on August 31st that the governor of Puerto Rico announced that it would buy into the FirstNet system, because all of these local governments are not going to have to pay AT&T to create this emergency response system. So Puerto Rico basically has an antiquated 911 system, and now when the people need it most, it's not functioning. But more importantly, the federal government has taken all this time since the attacks on the World Trade Center to come up with a workable 911 system in cases of natural disasters or terrorist attacks.
I wanted to go to Naomi Klein for a minute. We've had her on a lot, but years ago when she wrote The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, she described how governments often introduce radical free market reforms after disasters, when she's talking about the shock doctrine.
What I mean by the shock doctrine is the ways in which large-scale shocks to societies, large-scale crises, economic crises, wars, coups, natural disasters have systematically been used by right-wing governments, using the disorientation and the panic in society to push through a very radical pro-corporate agenda. You know, and I have been on the show many times talking about examples of this, like Hurricane Katrina, and how that tragedy and the dislocation of the residents of that city was used to privatize the school system, attack public housing, introduce a tax-free free enterprise zone under George Bush's administration.
So that was Naomi Klein years ago. Nelson Dennis, your thoughts on what she's saying and what could happen with Puerto Rico now?
Well, there's a tremendous historical precedent there. When the United States went in 1898, the very next year, the most devastating hurricane of the century, of the 19th century, Huracán San Ciriaco, flattened the island. It was actually worse than Hurricane Maria. And the response of the United States the following year, 1900, was to devalue the Puerto Rican currency by 40%. So that was the shock doctrine in its earliest application. And it worked. Within 30 years, the United States owned 80% of the arable agriculture in Puerto Rico. Well, you fast forward now, you have the Promesa legislation, the Financial Control Board, the Jones Act, and a dilatory president who's going to do a sort of a New Orleans flyover and photo op over Puerto Rico, and then basically create public-private partnerships that will own public infrastructure in Puerto Rico rather than redevelop it. And so that's where it's headed at this point, and it is basically the shock doctrine on steroids in the Caribbean. But this isn't time for fun and games. This is not an abstraction. These are human lives. 3.5 million people that don't have electricity and are projected to not have it for up to 6 months. And that electricity runs entirely on imported foreign oil that's brought in under inflated prices from the Jones Act. It's almost an international crime if we don't address this.
Now, Nydia Velázquez, I know, is right now, as we speak, drafting legislation around the Jones Act, Juan. You are an expert, Juan. You speak around the country on the Puerto Rican debt, the devastation, talking about what's happened to this American colony. How does that play in here? And do you see, even as the crisis is in full gear right now, I mean, with people, the entire island in the dark, the pieces being sort of reorganized?
Well, Amy, I've always maintained there was mention of the continual blackout that is occurring in Puerto Rico. The crown jewel of Puerto Rico today is the Puerto Rico Electric Company. It is the largest publicly owned utility in the United States. It generates billions of dollars in revenue. And there has been a long-time desire by the electric power industry of the United States to privatize the Puerto Rico Electric Company. And so the longer the blackouts continue, the greater the public cry will be to do something radical in terms of the Puerto Rico Electric Company. I noted in a piece I wrote for the Daily News earlier this week, last week, that in the month of June alone, 60% of the municipalities in Puerto Rico had blackouts. That's before the hurricane season. There's been a constant years and years of disinvestment in the Puerto Rico Electric Company. And now I think the private industry feels now is the time to actually move forward to basically privatize this company, and so that the profits from the company can flow to American investors, obviously, instead of generating revenue as the Puerto Rico Electric Company did for so many years for the Puerto Rican government.
As we begin to wrap up, Nelson Dennis, this issue of how the U.S. is treating Puerto Rico now and its status as a Commonwealth. For example, if it was an independent island right now, countries like Cuba, which has sent 750 doctors and health professionals around the Caribbean to help out in these storms, they could get aid from anywhere. But they can't get aid given that they are a U.S. Commonwealth, a territory of the United States.
Yeah. And they're completely under the plenary jurisdiction and exclusive jurisdiction of the U.S. Congress, which was affirmed in the Sanchez-Valles case last year. And Juan really hit the nail on the head. We're in a situation right now, they're called P3s, public-private partnerships. But in Puerto Rico, they're P5s, public-private partnerships for the plunder of Puerto Rico. And it's going to happen under an accelerated basis. And there's the public and the private component. The public is the Jones Act. If we don't see any of the Jones Act relief, that Juan is right on top of that. That means that it's a run-up, that it's a precursor to the privatization of the public infrastructure of Puerto Rico, because that is what will happen next if we don't suspend the Jones Act.
Well, of course, we'll continue to follow this. I want to thank you both for being with us. Nelson Dennis, former New York State Assemblyman. We'll link to your piece in the New York Times, The Law Strangling Puerto Rico. And Juan, I hope you feel better. I hope you're able to reach your sister in Puerto Rico. Juan Gonzalez, Democracy Now! Co-host his latest book, Reclaiming Gotham. Juan, you're headed to Kansas City on Friday night. Is that right?
Yes. I'll be there doing participating in a fundraiser for KKFI, one of the radio stations there, and then I'll be moving on to University of Maryland on Saturday. In
College Park. Thanks so much, Juan. Thank you so much, Nelson Dennis. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, a call for an international inquiry into the devastation of Yemen, the mass killings, both from the U.S.-backed Saudi bombing and the cholera outbreak. We'll speak with the first Yemeni civilian to address the UN Security Council. Stay with us.
En mi alma ya no puedo continuar caminando, ya no puedo continuar sin un descanso.
Abandoned Road, the Puerto Rican singer Lucecita Benitez. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman as we turn now to the U.S.-backed Saudi bombing campaign in Yemen that's been raging for 3 years, killing more than 10,000 civilians in the Arab world's poorest country. The conflict has ravaged Yemen's infrastructure, stripped the country of social services, triggered a massive cholera outbreak. Now there are growing calls from around the world for the creation of an independent probe into human rights violations committed by both sides. And this week, the UN Human Rights Council is slated to vote on a resolution to launch an investigation sponsored by the Netherlands, Canada, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Ireland. Meanwhile, the Associated Press reports Saudi Arabia responded to the proposal with threats, sending a letter to two of the sponsoring countries that said if independent investigators are sent to Yemen, it could negatively affect trade and diplomatic ties with the wealthy kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Well, for more, we're joined by Radia al-Mutawakkil, chairwoman of the Yemeni NGO Muwatina, Organization for Human Rights. In May, she became the first representative of Yemeni civilian society to brief the UN Security Council on the war in Yemen. She's also calling for the establishment of this international commission. Radia, welcome to Democracy Now! Tell us what you're calling for, and talk about the international probe that's been proposed by a number of countries being opposed by the country that's bombing Yemen right now, Saudi Arabia.
Yeah. For this is the first year that, since 2012, that NGOs and some countries are trying to push for the international independent inquiry, but it never happens. Not because the situation in Yemen doesn't deserve such tool, but because Saudis, they don't want such thing to be happened. So it's a very negative message. It's just like a green light for all parties to the conflict, not only Saudis and Emiratis, but also these armed groups in the ground, as they have the green light to do violations. And we can see that from year to another in Yemen, the violations are increasing and there is no any kind of accountability.
So talk about the ravaging of your country. 10,000 people dead. It's 600,000 infected with cholera at this point because of the devastation of the infrastructure.
Yes, and already 2,000 people only in 4 months have been killed because of the cholera. Cholera should be something you can be treated of, but because the health system in Yemen is collapsed because of the war, then 2,000 people was killed. Because we have also the Minister of Famine, more than 7 million people are just, they might just face the famine. All humanitarian agencies, they have emphasized that this situation in Yemen, it's a humanitarian disaster, but it's a man-made disaster. It is because of the conflict. So all the violations that have been committed by different groups in the ground and in the air just led to this humanitarian situation in Yemen. So we think that international independent inquiry is not a huge thing. It's just one small step to send a message to those parties to the conflict that they can't go on with their violations. But what is very disappointing that even this small step was not done because one of the countries, which is Saudis, they don't want it to be done.
Why does Saudi Arabia not want to be investigated?
Because they have committed a lot of violations in Yemen. Saudi Arabia, with the coalition with Saudi and Emirati coalition, they have striked everything in Yemen. We in Muwatina has documented more than 132 incidents when thousands of civilians were killed and injured. Most of them were children and women. But I want to say that not only Saudi Arabia and Emirates who really deserves
the United Arab Emirates.
The United Arab Emirates. We also have the Yemeni armed groups in the ground, Houthi and Saleh armed groups and other armed groups that under the umbrella of Hadi president, they are also committing violations. And the international independent inquiry should investigate the violations of all these groups, but Saudi Arabia is just acting as they are the only one who's committing violations, and they just against this international independent inquiry.
What about the role of the U.S.? President Trump's first trip, this was unprecedented, his first foreign trip was to Saudi Arabia, famously doing the sword dance, his family being there with him, talking about them as dear friends. Of course, President Obama had been there before, something like 4 times. But what are your thoughts on the U.S. military deals with Saudi Arabia and Amnesty International's recent finding involving the American bomb that killed an entire family in Sana'a?
Yes. Well, while the U.S. can play a very positive role in building the peace in Yemen, which is very possible, they are fueling the war by political support and also by the arms transfer to Saudi Arabia. So they can do, and they transfer the weapons to Saudi Arabia. At the same time, they don't support the international independent inquiry. So we can say that they are fueling this war. It's not only the U.S., it's the U.S. and the U.K. and also France. And some other countries are involved also in sending weapons to Saudi. So we can say that the international and then the financial interest became here more important than blood of innocent people, which is really sad.
So what do you want to happen right now? There is the most, one of the most painful quotes recently that just came out as people describe the situation. Jamie McGoldrick, the UN humanitarian coordinator in Yemen, told a group of reporters September 20th he sees no hope on the horizon for Yemen, saying the prescription for the future is bleak, at the very best bleak, a disaster, the humanitarian crisis only getting much, much worse, people dying in corners of the country in silent deaths. You've got 400,000 kids under the age of 5 who are acutely malnourished. Those numbers growing because half of health structures don't work, 1,700 schools don't function, 30,000 health workers don't have salaries, no operational budgets, 2 million kids out of school. It's a lost generation.
So it is a very serious and bad situation, but the hope is there. What is really sad about Yemen, that peace is always possible, but it never happens. Not because the situation is complicated, because no one cares. So when we just come even to international independent inquiry, as I said, it's a very small step. It never happens in Yemen. And we think that such international independent inquiry will just help peace process. There are some countries who are trying to do a fake link between immunity and peace, which we have tried this in 2011 in Yemen, and it has never worked. It will never work. Accountability will just bring peace and will just make some pressure on parties to the conflict to go to the table. So it's a disaster, but the hope is always there, and now it's possible more than any other time, because now most of these armed groups, including Saudi Arabia and other countries, are still with political leaders, and they can be pushed or encouraged to go to the table. But now Saudi Arabia and the United Emirates, they are empowering fanatic religious groups and in the areas that they are controlling with President Hadi. Those fanatic religious groups will never go to the table if they are empowered and extend more and more. They will never go to the table. They don't care about the international independent inquiry, and they will be the most dangerous future for Yemen. So the chance is now, and it's still very possible.
Do you plan to go back to Yemen?
Yes, because I have Muatana. We are a team of 60 people, so they need me. But I'm
the human rights group, Muatana.
Yeah, but I'm here for security reasons, because there was a lot of hate campaign against Muatana and the leaders of Muatana. But I will go back at any moment.
Well, please be safe, and thank you for stopping by to talk about the crisis in Yemen. Radia Al-Mutawakkil, a Yemeni activist, chairwoman of the human rights NGO Muatana, Organization for Human Rights. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. When we come back, we'll be joined by the Nobel laureate, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, Muhammad Yunus from Bangladesh. Stay with us.
Why is it so hard to make it in America? I tried so hard to make it in America, a land of milk and honey, a land supposed to be built with love. It takes love and understanding to live and let live. Then I moved to Brooklyn, New York. Had hard times, but sometime I hold on. Why is it so hard to make it in America?
Why Is It So Hard by Charles Bradley, known as the Screaming Eagle of Soul. He died Saturday in New York at the age of 68. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We end today's show looking at the humanitarian crisis unfolding in Burma, where more than 400,000 members of the Rohingya Muslim minority have fled Burma after hundreds of their villages were burned to the ground. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has accused the Burmese government of waging a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. Hundreds of thousands of Rohingya have crossed the border into neighboring Bangladesh, which is struggling to shelter and feed the influx of refugees as it recovers from the worst monsoon season in decades. Floodwaters submerged about a third of the entire country of Bangladesh. This is Rohingya refugee Chaman Bahar speaking from a makeshift shelter in Bangladesh.
The military torched our houses. My husband, along with my daughter and her husband, were killed in the clashes. I somehow was able to flee, taking my grandson along with all these villagers.
Bangladesh says it's now preparing to construct shelters for 6,000 Rohingya children who've entered Bangladesh alone to escape violence in Burma. At the United Nations General Assembly last week, Bangladesh's leader laid out a plan to eventually repatriate Rohingya refugees, repatriate them back to Burma. Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina said the UN should set up safe zones in Burma for returning refugees.
To see that the Myanmar authorities are laying landmines along their stretch of the border to prevent the Rohingyas from returning to Myanmar. These people must be able to return to their homeland in safety, security, and dignity.
In recent days, Bangladeshi authorities have sharply restricted the movements of Rohingya refugees, telling them they can't leave their makeshift camps, ordering drivers not to transport Rohingya and landlords not to rent to them. Most recently, the Bangladeshi government reportedly has banned its cell phone carriers from selling SIM cards to Rohingya refugees. For more, we're joined by Mohammed Yunus, the founder and managing director of Grameen Bank, recipient of the 2006 Nobel Peace Prize. He and over a dozen other Nobel Peace laureates have signed a letter calling on the United Nations Security Council to intervene to protect the Rohingya and end the humanitarian crisis in Burma. Mohammed Yunus has a new book. It's called A World of Three Zeros, the New Economics of Zero Poverty, Zero Unemployment, and Zero Net Carbon Emissions. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us.
Thank you very much.
Let's start with the crisis of the Rohingya, and then I want to talk with you about climate change, about Bangladesh, a third of the country flooded, and about poverty, the issues that you've taken on for so long. But what is happening with the Rohingya?
It's an unbelievable situation. It's all this happening under the leadership of a Nobel Peace Prize winner.
You're referring to Aung San Suu Kyi, the de facto
leader of the nation.
So she's a sister Nobel Peace Prize winner.
Absolutely. We have been working together for many years. Suddenly we see a completely different face for her.
This is a woman who was imprisoned, either house arrest or jail, for 15 years by the very military she's now working with, that is responsible for the ethnic cleansing.
The world supported her. She stood for democracy. She stood for human rights. She stood for all the human values you can think about. Her speeches are full with all these values, upholding these values for her nation. And he suffered. She was in prison, in the house under house arrest for many, many years. And now she comes to power, and we see completely different face from the Peace Nobel laureate. And she defends this in saying that we don't know why these Rohingyas are leaving this country. So there's so many reports coming, and you have reports from international press, media, and so on. And I have been inviting her to come to Bangladesh, see these people, and tell them that Myanmar is as much as their country as hers. And I have come to take you back to your
Myanmar, the name that the military has renamed Burma.
Yeah, the Burma. I'm taking you back to Burma. She doesn't do that. And you mentioned about 400,000 already coming in a very drastic circumstance, dead bodies floating on the border river, and all the atrocities that go on behind the whole thing that are coming. And UN estimate is by the end of the year it will exceed 1 million refugees coming from Burma. the whole estimate that is given by the government of Burma, that there's about 1 million Rohingyas in the country. So if you have 1 million coming to Bangladesh, what is left in you? So when people say it's ethnic cleansing, it's a perfect example of ethnic cleansing. Many government leaders like President Macron and others were saying this is genocide, a very clear case of genocide that is taking place. And the world has not taken a definitive step. They have condemned individually and so on. Still, UN Security Council, to whom we have appealed, please step in, do something so that people can go back to their own homes. And if it is delayed, it will become more complicated, and terrorism and other things will flourish in this region, and the whole stability of the region will be at risk.
If Aung San Suu Kyi said stop the ethnic cleansing, could she stop it alone? Would the military listen to her?
The role of the leadership is to be bold. Even if it's not happening right now, you stand for something. You don't just give in, say, okay, what can I do? Even that she's not saying. She doesn't say, what can I do? She simply says, I don't know where they are living. I didn't see anything wrong. So that's not a good kind of leadership. And then she's stopping all the foreign visitors, all the foreign observers to come in. She has not allowed any foreign visitors to come in. Even the media cannot go. So people have immediate reason to believe that something terribly wrong happening inside of Myanmar or Burma.
And what about Bangladesh's response?
Bangladesh has opened the border. They're coming in. Bangladesh don't have immediate resources to settle all those people, so we need international help. It's not a small number. It's a huge number to give them shelter, to give them food. You need a structure to make it happen, and diseases and all the terrible things they have come back with, medical problems that they have them inside of them. So these are the things that we have to address.
What can the UN Security Council or the UN General Assembly, what can the UN do?
You can do a lot of things. They have many, many ways to do that. They can give sanctions. They can send commissions to study the situation and come back. And luckily, the Annan Commission, Kofi Annan Commission, which was appointed by Aung San Suu Kyi's government, and most of the commission members are Burmese citizens. 6 of them are Burmese citizens, 3 of them are outsiders, including Kofi Annan. They made a recommendation of the commission report, and a very elaborate recommendation. And all we are saying, now that you accepted those recommendations, officially they have accepted, go ahead and implement it, and have an international body to supervise and help you implement that. So this is not something we are saying which is not accepted by them. They have accepted it, but they don't do anything about it. They just say that we have created an implementation committee, which is their own people at the leadership positions in the government, which people are not very sure whether they will move in the direction of implementation of those recommendations that they are.
Now, now let's talk about what Bangladesh is facing in addition to the hundreds of thousands of Rohingya coming in. And that is the issue of climate change. I mean, you come into this country, I know you're speaking at the Brooklyn Public Library tonight. You come into this country, you see the catastrophe, the climate catastrophe in Puerto Rico, Florida, Texas, these hurricanes incoming more frequently, more intense. A third of your country, Bangladesh, is underwater.
You said all the words that I was about to say. It's unbelievable that this country, which is a flat country, by the way, it's 1/4 of the country is just about 1 meter above the sea level. So the global warming as it takes place, sea level rises, Bangladesh just slides into the sea. And so this is the position that every year we are getting more and more into the sea than we were before. And it's a very tightly packed country. In a small territory of 150 million people, sorry, 150,000 square kilometers, we have 160 million people. So it's more than 1,000 people per square mile of the whole country. It's the most densely populated country in the world. So if land goes into the water, your land becomes uncultivable, you cannot grow food for yourself, and you have to leave your territory, land that you used to live. So it's becoming a situation where February, we'll have hundreds of thousands of climate refugees moving around to find shelter for ourselves. On top of it, you have the new refugees coming from Burma to find shelter with us. So these are happening not because Bangladesh is doing something wrong for the climate situation or worsening the climate situation. It's because something is happening somewhere else, and it's coming to us. And the floods that you mentioned, floods, we used to know flood, but now the feature of the flood is it's more frequent and more intensive.
So how does it feel to come to a country, the United States, where the president, President Donald Trump, has denied climate change, called it a Chinese hoax, pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Accord?
It's unbelievable. We can't believe that the President of the United States can say such a thing. It took us more than 40 years of global mobilization, making people aware of what the amazing thing this climate change is, and it soon will be reaching the point of no return. Even if we try, we cannot save the planet anymore. So we all got together, finally, all the countries got together in Paris to sign the Paris Agreement. And today, that Paris Agreement exists, but suddenly, President of the United States says we are withdrawing from that Paris Agreement. It takes away the whole thrust of the movement that built up around the world. So we are very unhappy and very, very disappointed that that such a position is taken. I hope the U.S. will review that position and go back to Paris Agreement and give the full throat support to it so that it makes it happen. A country like China is moving ahead, India is moving ahead. The countries people suspected that they will not agree to the Paris Agreement or any kind of attempt to save the planet from the global warming because they want to develop the country first before they get into all these issues. Well, they are the one that are taking the leadership role, where the United States is withdrawing from that.
We'll be broadcasting from Paris tomorrow from UNESCO headquarters, where I'm going to be speaking. But you wrote a book, A World of Three Zeros, the new economics of zero poverty, zero unemployment, and zero net carbon emissions.
Yes, indeed.
This book comes out at a time, what Oxfam came out with that report, the 8 richest men in the world own more wealth than half the world's population, more than 3.5 billion people. But talk about zero net carbon emissions, zero poverty.
All these three have to be achieved. There is no option for us, and I just lay down this is something. But the system which we have in practice, the capitalist system, I said capitalist system is not working towards it. It's a system which, as you mentioned, the 8 people owning more wealth than the bottom 50% of the people. It's a system which is like a machine which is sucking up wealth from the bottom and transporting it to the top. So the top is becoming a big mushroom of wealth. And then 99% of the people is like the stem from the mushroom hanging there. And that stem is becoming thinner and thinner. The portion of the wealth devoted to bottom 99, or the 99%, we don't say bottom anymore, will become smaller. And relatively, the top becoming bigger and bigger. I said this is a ticking time bomb. Anytime it can explode politically, socially, economically, and so on, we are not paying attention to it. Wealth concentration was going on ever since we introduced capitalist system, but this was not very visible. Today, it's becoming worse and worse. The speed of wealth concentration has become speedier and speedier. Years back, there was a couple of years back, there were 32 people who owned half the wealth of the bottom 50%. And now we have 8. Soon we'll have 5. Soon we'll have 2 people owning the whole entire world's wealth together. So those are the kind of things that threatening. When concentration of wealth takes place, it also the concentration of power. Wealth and power go together. So you control the government, you control the politics, you control the media, you control businesses, everything. So that's the kind of situation coming. And all the people at the bottom 10%, 20%, 50%, they will have tremendous anger against the way that's being done and how to express themselves. That will create the disastability in the society.
Which is a perfect launching point for part 2 of our discussion, which we will post online at democracynow.org. Muhammad Yunus, founder of the Grameen Bank, recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. His new book, A World of Three Zeros, the new economics of zero poverty, zero unemployment, and zero net carbon emissions. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.